Good evening. It's an honor to be here. I want to thank WWF for the invitation to work and collaborate on this project. And what I'm going to present here, I'm basically going to try to condense 16,000 words into about 15, 17 minutes. The report I'm presenting, which we did for WWF, was developed by Marcia Macedo and myself. So, a lot has been said about the Amazon over the last 30 or 40 years. And most of the discussion in the whole world about the Amazon has focused on the effects of deforestation, impacts on terrestrial biodiversity, impacts on terrestrial carbon stocks. But very little has been said about the impacts of human activities on freshwater ecosystems. One thing that few people know is that freshwater ecosystems are very vulnerable to human activities, essentially because they are connected to almost everything else via the hydrological cycle. In the Amazon, the hydrological cycle can be summarized more or less as this. There is moisture coming from the Atlantic Ocean being blown over the basin by the trade winds, where it precipitates and falls over the basin in the form of rainfall. The forests absorb the water to perform photosynthesis, and in the process, they return part of that water back to the atmosphere in the form of evapotranspiration. The remainder of the water that is not used by forests to perform photosynthesis eventually falls in the soils and drains to the nearest stream or river and falls into freshwater ecosystems. Freshwater ecosystems, they are also recharged by direct rainfall, and they lose some of the water back to the atmosphere via evaporation. The remainder of the water is routed and transported downstream until it eventually reaches the Atlantic Ocean again. So freshwater ecosystems in the Amazon are connected to the oceanic, atmospheric, and terrestrial systems in three main ways. First, vertically, through process of rainfall, evaporation, and evapotranspiration. Second, laterally, as terrestrial ecosystems drain their water through runoff onto freshwater ecosystems, and freshwater ecosystems, via natural variability in flows, flood terrestrial ecosystems. And lastly, freshwater ecosystems are connected longitudinally among themselves and between themselves and the Atlantic Ocean in the process of water discharge. So in this presentation, we are addressing the fundamental questions of what are the causes and consequences of hydrological alteration to Amazon freshwater ecosystems. This is the most important question because even though freshwater ecosystems are very vulnerable to changes in hydrology, this question pretty much remains unanswered. So, like Yolanda mentioned, freshwater ecosystems in the Amazon are super important. Amazonians are known as water peoples because they depend and live on the water. I will mention four main ecosystem services to highlight their importance. Number one, and this is probably the better known one, maintenance of species diversity. Freshwater ecosystems in the Amazon sustain one of the highest diversities of freshwater species on the planet. In terms of freshwater fish species, there are 2,500 species that have already been described. That alone is much more than what is available in North America and is almost what is available in Asia and Africa combined. Second, ecosystem service provided: filtration, transport, and regulation of flows of water and materials. What does that mean? It means that it is in places such as these in the picture where rain falls in the forest and it drains to the nearest stream that freshwater ecosystems filter the water as it enters freshwater ecosystems, and it organizes their transport and begins this transport all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And in doing so, it also regulates those flows, making sure that there is water year-round. This process is fundamental for people because it allows Amazonians to have access to high quality water, allows Amazonians to have access to navigation routes, and allows people to derive electricity from rivers and streams. Third ecosystem service, carbon processing. A lot is talked about how important terrestrial forests are for carbon budgets in the tropics. Yet, river floodplains in the central Amazon, they produce on average 17 megagrams of carbon per hectare per year. That is about 5 times more carbon produced by terrestrial forest. That means that freshwater ecosystems in the Amazon play significant roles in regional carbon budgets. And lastly, fish protein production. Commercial fish species in the Amazon have evolved very complex migratory strategies. To highlight some of those strategies, I have organized them in terms of the total distances performed. There are species that migrate tens of kilometers, hundreds of kilometers, even thousands of kilometers. Fish migrate these distances because in doing so, they increase the productivity of their populations by several fold. Humans take advantage of that increased productivity to sustain one of the world's highest rates of per capita fish consumption. Riverine populations in the Amazon consume, on average, 94 kilos of fish per year on a per capita basis, which is 6 times more the global average. So, there are 3 main drivers of hydrological alteration. The better known is dams. I have briefly explained that in natural conditions, streams and rivers lose some of water back to the atmosphere in the form of evaporation. There is natural seasonality in river flows that connect streams and rivers to adjacent freshwater ecosystems, and freshwater ecosystems obviously discharge water downstream. Dams disrupt the lateral, longitudinal, and vertical connectivity of freshwater ecosystems in 3 main ways, primarily because the construction of dam reservoirs increases the area exposed by the waters so that it increases evaporation. Increased evaporation means that there is decreased discharge. Also, the construction of a blockade that attenuates seasonal floods decreases seasonal flood variability, thereby decreasing connectivity between downstream river waters and adjacent terrestrial ecosystems. Land cover change or deforestation. As I explained before, in natural conditions, rain falls over forests. Forests emit some of their water back to the atmosphere via evapotranspiration, and the remainder of the water drains via runoff into a stream or river. The removal of the forest decreases the amount of evapotranspiration, thereby increasing the amount of runoff, or basically of water going into the stream or river. And this increases total discharge in rivers. Lastly, we have mining. Mining is a poorly recognized driver of hydrological alteration. In addition to promoting huge amount of pollution of all sorts and of nasty types, mining often leads to the construction of new hydroelectric dams and widespread land cover changes. So, the bad news is that the situation with freshwater ecosystems today is more or less what is depicted here in our map on the screen. In yellow, in our map, this is a busy map, but if you bear with me, in yellow we have deforestation. A lot of deforestation has happened in the southeastern and southern flanks of the basin, and there is no deforestation happening in the western flanks. The dots denote hydroelectric dams that are either in place or under construction or planned to be constructed in the next few decades. You can see there are several hundred dams constructed in the southeastern, southern, and western flanks of the Amazon. And lastly, there are lots of mining activities for iron ore, bauxite, and oil, mostly occurring in the western flank of the Amazon, in the Andean Amazon, and also in the Guyana Amazon. A situation like this obviously causes many impacts. The impacts of these drivers of hydrological alteration on freshwater ecosystems are too many, but I will highlight some of the most important ones. In terms of physical processes, land cover changes by removing the natural vegetation tend to increase erosion and the deposition and inputs of sediment, including nutrients, into stream or river waters, thereby often leading to eutrophication. Land cover changes, when they occur at very large scale, they also have significant effects on hydrology and sediment transport at the level of entire watersheds. In the Araguaia-Tocantins River Basin, deforestation of more than 50% of the watershed has led to an increase of more than 25% in the amount of water transported by the river, and an increase of 31% of the amount of sediment transported this river. This river has had, therefore, to fundamentally change its morphology to be able to carry the increased amounts of water and sediment. The construction of dam reservoirs has many impacts. One of them is that dam reservoirs usually act as traps for organic carbon. Increased organic carbon being deposited in dam reservoirs leads to increased methane emissions coming out of those reservoirs and decreased carbon dioxide and methane emissions coming from downstream the dams. Finally, we have mercury production. These same reservoirs often stratify in temperature and create layers of water with low levels of oxygen in the deeper layers. Low levels of oxygen leads to the formation of methyl mercury, which is a type of mercury that is poisonous and that we should be concerned about. Mercury being produced in the dam reservoirs flows downstreams, contaminates biota and even humans. Now, in terms of biological processes, land cover changes occurs often in very large extent, primarily in riparian zones, because most of the Amazonian population used to live by a river or stream. In the lower Amazon region, deforestation has already affected more than 50% of the original forest. In areas such as these, the impacts of biodiversity have been tremendous and largely unrecognized. Changes in the natural seasonality of river or stream flows has several effects. One of them is changing the natural selection for trees that are tolerant to flooding. These areas where they change their natural selection for, where they change the natural variability of flows, change the selectivity of the trees and plant species that are adapted to these ecosystems, thereby, in the long run, changing the species composition. Changes in natural hydrology also lead to changes in primary productivity, including carbon production, and also affects the lives of pretty much all of the larger biota, including not only crocodiles, as shown in the pictures, but all of the commercial fish species, as well as dolphins, turtles, and other animals. Reservoirs again. Reservoirs essentially transform a habitat that is free-flowing in water to one that resembles lake. This threatens specialist endemic species and favors what is called generalist species, thereby, again, changing the species composition of these systems. And finally, the construction of dam reservoirs, as well as changing natural hydrology, disrupt the migrations done by commercial fish species in the Amazon, which has the effect of decreasing their productivity, decreasing fish yields, and of threatening regional food security. So, what is being done to try to curb the situation? There are four main sets of policies in place in Amazonian countries. Unfortunately, however, these policies are not sufficient to fully curb the effects. Protected areas, over the last 30 or 40 years, there has been a lot of debate and attention on protected areas in the Amazon. Protected areas have been seen as the paradigm in Amazon conservation, as the solution to the conservation of the Amazon. 36% of the Amazon today is under some form of protection by different types of protected areas. However, the vast majority of the protected areas have been implemented based on data of terrestrial taxa or indigenous people, and they largely ignore the hydrological connectivity of the basin. So, for purposes of protecting freshwater biodiversity or ecosystem services, they are not sufficient. Let me show you here an example with the Madeira River Basin. At the headwaters of the river basin, there are lots of dams, some mining happening. Then in dark green, we have some protected areas, and then lots of deforestation, more dams. Protected areas downstream of these areas, they essentially cannot protect freshwater biodiversity because all the threats are outside the protected area boundaries, are upstream of these boundaries. Land use policy is obviously a very important tool to curb deforestation. In recent years, Brazil has made huge achievements in reducing deforestation rates, which peaked almost at 30,000 square kilometers a year to a low of near 5,000 square kilometers. This was largely achieved via improvements in law enforcement, changes in soy and beef supply chains, limited access to no credit, which used to be used for purposes of causing deforestation, and increase in the number and extent of protected areas. However, these policies are as a whole still fragile and vulnerable, as evidenced by a recent spike in deforestation in the last year. Water resources legislation. We are going to hear much more about water resources legislation in a few minutes. All Amazonian countries are in the process of implementing water resources legislation, and they are pretty much somewhat similar in their main characteristics. I will here characterize Brazil's water resources legislation as an example. It establishes, following standard principles, that water are finite resources, subject to various uses, and vulnerable to human use. And it determines that management must be done at the level of the catchment and must be decentralized and participatory. All these principles are very necessary for adequate management of water resources. However, there are three main deficiencies when it comes to the present situation with freshwater ecosystems in the Amazon. The first one is that they're being implemented within country boundaries, and in doing so, they are ignoring the international connectivity of freshwater ecosystems in the Amazon. Second, they mostly focus on H2O, in other words, in water as a chemical substance, not on freshwater ecosystems, which are very different from water per se. And lastly, this legislation mostly exists on paper and not in de facto, so they can be said not to exist in reality. Last form of policies for freshwater conservation in the Amazon is the environmental licensing of dams. These are essentially the process by which firms of governments trying to construct new hydroelectric dams in the region, the process that authorize or regulate the construction of new dams. Brazil, Peru, and Colombia are the three countries that possess these legislations, and these legislations are more or less similar. Because Brazil's legislation has been studied to some level of detail, I'll focus on it. The process essentially aims to ensure that constructed dams are economically attractive and while causing minimal environmental and social cost. The process is essentially a series of steps that begins with an inventory and viability study, a series of environmental impact assessment studies that are reviewed by governmental agencies, and once are approved, then proceed to a series of public hearings or consultation with local populations. When that process is then finalized, then the process begins of issuing preliminary and then installation licenses. This process is very similar to the same process that is used in other places of the world and looks on the surface to be technically correct. However, we identify four main deficiencies. Number one is that it exempts dams smaller than 10 megawatts in size. In Brazil alone, there are hundreds of dams smaller than 10 megawatts in size, which altogether can easily cause more harm to the environment than one or a few large hydroelectric dams. Second deficiency, the bulk of the environmental impact assessment studies are in fact species inventories list. They are not so much critical ecological studies based on ecological hypotheses that aim to evaluate the impacts on the environment. Third, the entire process is riddled with conflict of interest. Number one, the companies that construct the dams are the ones that pay the scientists to produce the environmental impact assessment studies. So those developing the studies have an economic incentive to minimize negative findings. Second, the results of all the reports are subject to full approval by the construction firm. That means that in the process, interesting findings may be lost or may be discarded without the public being aware of it. Finally, and perhaps more importantly, the entire process has been shown to be very vulnerable to external pressure. Just as an example, I'll cite that in recent years there was a large dam in Brazil that was approved by the federal government before the environmental impact assessment studies had been concluded. So, what can we do to move forward? And most of the presentations after me will focus on that. It seems obvious that what is necessary is a catchment-based framework for the conservation of freshwater ecosystems. This framework for conservation will be very different from anything that has been done so far, and will also be very different from most conservation strategies done in the entire planet, essentially because the Amazon is so big. What is necessary to conserve freshwater ecosystems in the Amazon is a concerted strategy that is implemented at the level of the entire basin and in all Amazonian countries. Unless this one requirement is fulfilled, the strategy is likely to fail. I cannot possibly mention all the requirements and characteristics of such a framework here, but I will just emphasize that protected areas, land use policies, water resources legislation, and licensing of dams, all these policy sets, if improved, they could form the core basis of a basin-wide framework for the entire Amazon, which obviously would require international collaboration and implementation. Having said that, I want to thank you for your attention. And in particular, I want to thank the invitation by Claudio Maretti and Denise Oliveira in organizing this event and collaboration on the project. Thank you.